So I believe we are on. And welcome everyone to Conexões UBC or UBC Connections. This is a series of panels where we talk to industry specialists about the business of music. And this will be a very special episode, as for the first time, we're reaching out globally with the help of our co-hosts, Your Music, Your Future, and CISAC. So while today's topic is by no means a new one, it certainly has come back to the forefront in recent years, which is the difference between royalty payments and buyout of music rights. To talk us through it, I want to welcome our guests with a quick introduction. We are joined today by Your Music, Your Future founder, Joe Beckerman, CISAC Director of Legal Affairs, Cristina Perpignan Robert Navarro, CQS FV Law Firm Specialist Lawyer, Igor Valerio, and Music Rights Consultant and ex-CEO of UBC, Marisa Gandelman. It is my pleasure and big privilege to welcome you all today, and thank you for being here. So I want to kick things off, and I want to start with Joel. So Joe, if you would be so kind, I would like you, well, let's start with the basics really, let's explain what is the difference between royalty-based payments and buyouts.
Got it. So just to take a half a step back for those who may not be aware of Your Music, Your Future, Your Music, Your Future is an education campaign. It's by composers for composers. And really, we recognized that there was a niche that was not covered, which is a very singular focus on performance royalties and how composers who are brand new to the industry, who are very accomplished, longtime folks in the industry, where there's a lot of times people think of us as being competitive with each other, where actually there's tremendous camaraderie in the States. So that information campaign specifically is to help composers understand in the States there are choices, but the choices are doing buyouts as compared to in your contracts insisting upon performance royalties. Performance royalties, for those who may not be aware of what that is, performance royalties essentially ensure that every time your work is played in association with a successful project, that you receive a small royalty, which hopefully over many years, you've created a number of works which are played frequently, hopefully around the world, and you collect funds that are really in direct association with your contribution to that audiovisual work. Buyouts essentially mean you get one lump sum fee up front, and you never see a penny after that. I also would be remiss to talk about performance royalties without mentioning things, where sometimes television shows and films they play for a while, they go away for a while, they come back in different windows. So these are essentially annuities that bring composers revenue over time. When we do the math and we talk to the composers that we speak with, it's essentially there is no way to make a sustainable living as a composer without performance royalties. We're required often to do spec work. We have to create our own, we have to purchase our own equipment. We have to take care of software that needs to be constantly upgraded, and all these things cost money. So that's really what Your Music, Your Future is that specific, just very narrow topic about performance royalties, as you mentioned, Peter, as distinct from what buyouts are and what that means. I also just want to, I know I'm speaking long on this, but forgive me, I just want to make sure I get this out. The Your Music, Your Future really started out solely as a US effort. And through the work of CISAC and now UBC, which I really applaud all the effort and energy that you've brought forward to this to remind us that this is not just a US issue, this is a global issue. And composers throughout the world are united on this, the education role, to understand in the US what has been a 100-year deal, which is, again, just for the US. You can own the copyrights of the work that we create with the understanding that we can collect performance royalties from the PRO, Performance Rights Organization of our choice. And that essentially has been the reciprocity, the understanding of what that deal has been for 100 years. So composers have kept that part, and we really insist that the partners that we work with, the production companies and the studios, retain their, essentially do their part to be able to make sure that there can be this generation of composers that can come up and continue to be expert and focus solely on the music, which creates tremendous value in the audiovisual works. And these discussions around buyouts are very troubling. And again, in the US, people have a choice. You can do that, but it's very important that we educate people to understand the difference. This is why we put a number of charts and information up on our website, which CSAC has done an amazing job in terms of capturing that material in a way that is global, to be able to translate this into many languages, which we can talk more about later, because I think I've overstayed my welcome. But this really is the backdrop of Your Music, Your Future as an education campaign. If you look at the website, you can see that many of the most successful, famous names as composers have signed on as supporters. And I know that this continues to be, and many on the CSAC site, and I know that this will only continue in terms of this idea of community of composers globally, supporting community of composers globally.
Excellent. That's very good to know that, because it's important that to get the message across that this has to be a global initiative, right? So that there has been actually a translation of the Your Music, Your Future site to Portuguese in collaboration with Portuguese Society, SPA, and with UBC to try to spread that message locally as well. And as we're talking about the globalization, let's say, of that subject, I want to bring Christina in then. So Christina is the Director of Legal Affairs for CSAC and has been very much involved in this discussion inside of CSAC. So if you could give us like a little briefing on that work and what it has meant inside of CSAC, Christina, that'd be very welcome.
Yeah, sure. I mean, first of all, Joel already mentioned that we have to thank UBC. In my case, already 2 years ago, I had an interview with UBC because UBC was really focusing on this issue on buyouts. So this is 2 years ago when we had started to analyze what was going on. We knew that this was starting to be a global concern for many creators and for many of our society members, from collecting societies from all over the world, which were seeing that this buyout phenomenon, let's say, was extending. It was, of course, we know that it was what was going on in the US. Joel has explained that, but we saw that this was increasing and this was starting to become a concern globally. So what CSAC did, and I think I talked about that already 2 years ago when I had my first interview with UBC, was try to figure out what was going on, why this was becoming an issue when we had not heard of this problem regarding buyouts as such a big issue until 2-3 years ago. And so we started, what CSAC did, basically what we tried to do is through our international network, try to find out whether there was like a legal background or legal explanation of why this was starting to become an issue globally. Because Joel has explained this very well. This is the difference between a royalty stream or a lump sum payment when a composer creates a work. But usually that is in exchange of something which we saw was new, which is this was an exchange to either a full assignment of all the rights or of basically most of the rights of that work, usually also for the entire duration of the copyright term, And many times it was a full worldwide assignment of rights. So we were seeing that something which was, let's say, typical, for example, in the mechanical rights field, for example, for advertising or for video games, for example, this was being extended to public performance rights, as Joel explained. So we were seeing buyouts in types of exploitations where that didn't happen before. So we're not just talking about VOD streaming services, which is, I guess, what made this very global, because obviously these platforms are global. So they were introducing these buyout provisions in their contracts globally. But we were also seeing buyouts in broadcasts, in residuals, as Joel explained before. So it was just becoming something which was completely new, because composers were seeing these provisions in their agreements, which they hadn't seen before. And you know, it's also important. I don't want to get very legal. Well, we have Igor and Marisa, we're going to explain more the Brazilian situation, the legal situation. But what we were seeing is that, you know, this is something which legally was affecting some countries or some jurisdictions which have very, very protective provisions in their laws, at least to make buyouts more difficult. So, for example, the case of Europe is very, you know, it's a good example, because in Europe, there's a lot of countries which have in their laws general principles to ensure that there's a proportional remuneration when there's an assignment of rights, that any type of contractual assignment ensures that there's a fair remuneration. So that's typical in many European countries, also in many Latin American countries. And we were seeing that that was just simply being circumvented in the contracts by making the subcontract subject to a foreign law. It could be US law, because as Joel explained, there's a works made for hire system, or other jurisdictions which maybe don't have these very strict legal provisions to protect creators, not just composers, but creators in general, against these just one-time flat sum against give me all the rights. And you're losing not only the economic royalties, which you're going to receive during the entire exploitation of the work in the future, but you completely surrender the control over your work. So we saw that in many cases in these provisions, creators just lost completely their link to their creation. So they would not be able to say, I want to include my work in Spotify, or to use it in something completely separated from that audiovisual work. They were just completely losing control over their creation.
That point you make is interesting, and you mentioned a little bit about this. Not like when we talk about this, we think a lot now about streaming services. I mean, in Brazil, I think that's one of the cases where this has been more frequent now. But it goes back. I always think of video games, for example, because video game soundtrack in the past they were very limited in the way that they could reach an audience, because they only did so when someone was playing a game. But we're living in an era now where video game soundtracks exist outside of the game itself as well. So you can find video game soundtracks on Spotify, you know, and they are popular. A lot of people love them, you know, because they have that attachment to the games. So that makes a point that it is a wider issue. It is not something that is just limited to audiovisual products. It can go across the board. That's very interesting, Christina. And I wondered, could you tell us a little bit? I mean, this must be a very complex subject for CISAC to kind of research and get their head around, because I imagine that globally you have all kinds of legislations across the board, which could make it very, you know, more or less difficult to impose these kinds of contracts. And CISAC actually did a study on that, right? Could you talk about that a little bit? What of the findings?
Yeah, so what we did in the beginning, when we saw that this was really starting to be a concern globally for creators and for our society members, we tried to understand how this was reaching out and starting to become practice in jurisdictions which usually were not used to these types of buyout provisions. So we did a global, let's say, a legal global study to understand from a contractual point of view how that was happening. And basically that led us to analyze more the European situation, but also to understand that this was usually based on the freedom of contract, that platforms were introducing and broadcasts were introducing these buyout provisions because they were making the contract subject to more, let's say, favorable jurisdictions for buyouts. But we also did a specific study from our regional area. So we focused on the Asia Pacific region also, because there, as you just mentioned, we saw that it was, of course, it was also related to VOD platforms, but also very much related to video games and video games which were being streamed. We were changing the typical sync license or mechanical rights license to different types of licenses, which were again covering much broader exploitations for buyouts. We also, our regional office in Latin America started to do a study on Latin American jurisdictions and countries in Latin America to see what was going on there. So we saw that there were very, very different types of legal regimes and with different ways to try to approach this problem. So based on all this feedback we got from the studies and from the feedback we got from our society, so I'm mentioning UBC because UBC's lawyer was one of the ones who was most active in our studies, in our feedback, but we got feedback from many parts of the world. What we did is also publish what we called guidelines, which were focusing on lobbying activities, which were lobbying actions which we could take around the world. Obviously in Europe, it's very, very timely because we have the copyright directive right now, which has a specific solution or an approach for buyouts. But we also try to see what are the solutions or the approaches which have been taking place in other parts of the world. So we published these guidelines, which are intended to give some recommendations for societies, but also to creators. So basically what we wanted to make sure is to say, look, it's a global problem, but there's some solutions which we can use across the world. And you know, some of them are obviously, there's more regional focus, like in Latin America, and I'm sure Igor and Marisa will help with this. We have a specific like unwaivable remuneration rights system which can help. But also there were other types of solutions, like ensuring that if there's an assignment of rights, that you can recover those rights in a certain period of time. Like, I think that's one of the solutions which is applied in Brazil, because you have a maximum 10-year limitation in order for assignments. But we also saw, this is, I think, going back to what Joe said, that we had to give some type of educational and awareness raising to creators so that they understand that many times they have to just know that there's other options. And it's true that many times, you know, when creators are faced these types of contracts or provisions in their contracts, many times they don't want to get in a problem with their employer. You know, they don't want to object to these clauses. They fear being blacklisted. You know, usually they're very vulnerable. So I think it was very important for them to understand, to give this message out that there's other options. Many times you don't need to sign that buyout. You can give full security and legal certainty to the platform by giving a less broad or worldwide or copyright, you know, duration assignment. There's other options. And we especially also included in our guidelines that, you know, this is what collective management was created for. The reason why UBC or ASCAP in the US or SAFIM in France, the reason they were created is by, you know, uniting all the creators. You have a very strong bargaining position, which is again what we're talking about. The reason why buyouts are so easy to enforce is because usually we're talking about young composers or vulnerable composers who either don't know that there's other options, or they don't want to,
don't feel that they have the leverage, right? Exactly. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, if we think, we were talking before the panel started, that unity is in our name of our society. So it is very important and significant to us. Thank you so much, Christina. Oh, please, Joe, go ahead.
Sorry to be rude here, but there was
no, please.
That Christina brought up, which I think is very valuable. I think in particular, recognizing, so, let's just get real with composers. There are many things you can do to understand your rights within the PRO system, to understand that you don't have to accept the terms that are just put in front of you. Almost everyone knows an attorney, either directly or through a friend. And even if it's not a music attorney, just to know that you can have some information that might be useful, to know an agent, to know another composer. Listen, I'm trying to put myself in the position of somebody who's just starting out all the time. And you want credits. You want a credit to allow you to get to the next job, to get to the next job, to get to the next job. And there's a tremendous fear that if you don't accept that first deal, that you'll never have a second show, or maybe you lose the show that you're being offered. So here's the piece of good news. In addition to educating yourself through these sites, is that almost all the streaming services have publicly said that if you push back and say that you don't want to operate through a buyout, almost invariably the pushback will be met with some kind of a compromise, or even better, just a complete change. Netflix in particular, again, there are the one service that was not offering that option was the Discovery networks, which we know there are many. And through, again, talk about unions, not a union, but really through the community, there was a very concerted effort globally, which helped Discovery to rethink their approach. And now they're going back through the systems. So to recognize that there is power through the PROs. There is power just in terms of knowledge from attorneys or other composers or agents to be knowledgeable. The issue with composers, me included, when I first started out with this, it's, when anybody talks to you about legal language, it's like, oh, well, let me just write some more music. But the reality is that this is a career. And if people want to have a career and not just get the gig, you really need to be knowledgeable and understand that you don't have to accept just what's been put in front of you.
Thank you, Joe. That's a very important point. Knowledge is power, and we should spread it as much as possible. I want to now maybe go from our wide zoom out of the global picture and go for a zoom in to Brazil, and to welcome our dear Marisa Gandelman. I wanted you to talk a little bit, Marisa, about Brazil specifically, the context for buyouts here in our territory, and maybe some of what do you feel is the market reaction to this?
Okay, hello everybody, the audience, colleagues. Peter, thank you. UBC, thank you. It's a bit my house as well.
Yeah.
And,
always.
Yes, because I always tell this story. My father had a phase in his life that he wanted to be a composer. So he had a UBC membership card from the year that I was born. So I was born in UBC. And I am from a family of musicians. I have a brother, composer, musician. I have a son, composer, musician, and all my friends. I was a performer myself, so I have kind of a passion for the subject. So I will speak from my point of view, the things that I hear from composers, and the more technical issues and things I will leave for my dear colleague Igor, because he's a very experienced lawyer in the corporate side, and then he knows the stories maybe from other points of view. So to begin with, I wanted to explain to you all and those that are listening to us that in Brazil, traditionally, the law is not copyright law, it's authors' rights law. So this follows the French tradition, droit d'auteur. So we have material rights, which is copyright, but we have very strong rules for moral rights. And the thing of authorship is unwaivable. It's forever. And so I used to say that maybe we have sort of a copyright plus. Why I say this? Because in the business, in the way that business was developed, there are lots of rules inside the law that permit, the assignment, complete, universal, forever, the assignment. There is no restriction in the law for copyright assignment, not for any kind of rights, but there is a rule in the law that says that composers can associate, can go together and create an association to manage to collect their rights. And composers should give mandates a mandate to the society with this purpose of why? Because it's impossible for one person individually to go and collect and license the performances, because one song can be performed in 100 places at the same time and you will never know. So traditionally, what happened here is that composers and publishers develop a kind of an agreement that involves copyright assignment. And it works well, traditionally. Before all the streaming platforms, before all the digital life. Because, the performing rights were guaranteed that composers, till now, they are paid by society. So they assign all rights, including performing rights, but they have the rights of remuneration according to the contract. So the general rule says that it's like sort of, you have the copyright, but you have like 25% of you publisher, 25% of all the money, and you pay out 75% of all the money to the composer, not only on performing rights, but all rights. Now, this is kind of typical contract. And this I can consider a very successful story in our music business, And also the composers, the guys that have the big catalogs because they have been composing all their lives, they created their own publishing companies and they sign administration agreements with the publishers only to take care of, the documentation and practical issues. However, what is changing really is the way music is offered and consumed.
Because we didn't used to hear about buyouts in Brazil so much or so often until a few years ago, right?
Never. There was not. We have in a media group, which is on TV, is TV Global, that they have really, they produce as a vertical structure. So they are exhibitors, they are broadcasters, they have their streaming platform, and they have newspapers, everything, but they have an army of composers and producers of soundtracks that they sign copyright assignments, but there is written there, the performing rights. So TV broadcaster pay a good amount of money for performing rights. So they are well paid. So the same one that is paying, the broadcaster that is paying this performing rights, they have kind of a lower price in production costs, because what they pay for the guys to produce, to create and produce is compensated. If it's not that good, it's compensated with the amount that they collect from the performance of all these works. So I say that we have this very typical special model of the whole structure of performing rights, and we have a very specific model of this TV broadcasting and pay TV production in Brazil, related to the possibility of composers collecting for performances. So just a second, Peter.
Sure, go ahead.
To finish my thinking. The problem that we have in the law nowadays is that there are some people and some lawyers that defend some companies that claim that according to the Brazilian law, everything that happens in the internet is not public performance. There is no public performance in the internet, you know? So this has been a long court case, series, and was finished in favor of composers. And so but the issue is not so. There's two issues. You have to change the law to define what is communication to the public, and that performing rights are included in this communication to the public. The way it's written, it gives space for legal discussions and creates some restrictions on the copyright assignment, or like Christina proposes, to have a possibility of creating the contracts, or at least guaranteeing, like the performing rights is guaranteed that it's going to be collected directly by the composers through the society, to all the rights to have a guarantee that composers will be paid. After the coming of the streaming film platforms, the agreements, the contracts that are being offered and quite forced because of economic power and the necessity of the composers are just terrible. It's like, I pay you, and I pay you very little, and you give me the music and you forgot about my existence, you know? And they stream and they pay the performing rights to the organization, but they are not very well organized to report, you know? So it's still very, very confusing, the situation, except for this TV that has all the broadcasting and the platform, the streaming platform. They like paying performing rights because they know that this makes their costs lower, their production costs lower. So the fact that to put composers together and performers together, because they have their problems as well, it's how to do this, you know, in a situation. And this is, I think, is really the why we want our composers to go together with your music, your future. And we trust CISAC will give some guidance really in lobbying activities. At this moment in Brazil is impossible, but next year, hopefully, we will manage to.
Thank you, Marisa. Yeah, I think it would be perfect for Igor to complement your comments, because I wanted to understand better. So this Brazilian environment that you described, the legal framework that we have in Brazil, if you could expand on that, especially maybe in comparison to what is more common outside of Brazil. I mean, we have established that there are many different ways this is set up in different countries, but if you could give us like a technical primer on how it differentiates and how it works.
Yeah, of course I can do that. But I wanted to make a quick introduction.
Of course, please do.
I want to mention two concepts, which I think one is adapted, the other one is 100% accurate. So the most famous legal scholar in Brazil, a guy called Miguel Reale, he's one of his greatest achievements in life is a theory according to which the law with a capital L is not just the norm, it's the norm, its facts, and its value. So the discussion between buyouts and remuneration rights is really a discussion that has legal implications, but really comes from elsewhere, especially the economics of the market that we're dealing with today. And the second one is an adaptation of that famous Peter Drucker quotation that says that culture eats strategy for breakfast. And in this case, I have to say that economics eat the law for breakfast sometimes. And that's basically what we see in this whole buyout discussion. And I think it's important to mention that the economic basis of this, and I have written down 4 pointers, 4 vectors for that, which need to be in everyone's mind to understand the buyout movement or the buyout reality that we're dealing with today. And the first one is today's world sees a conflation between producers and distributors of audiovisual content. And why is this important for the buyout matter? In the past, producers did not distribute and distributors did not produce. This means that when a producer is contracting content for his production, it is not a large concern whether the distributor of the content will have to deal with remuneration rights downstream in the economic chain. Whereas today's world, the producer is in a large portion of the market also the distributor of the content, and that is true especially for over-the-top platforms. And that means that his view of the whole economic chain in the audiovisual world also takes into consideration whatever costs the distribution operation will have. So that feeds the system back upstream in the production stage, telling it that there is a cost downstream that you have to deal with. And the economics will say, well, the lower the cost, the higher the profits. So there you have it. You have an economic reality that incentivizes buyouts. So that's vector number 1, conflation between production and distribution. Second thing, you have a very clear internationalization of the distribution business. And that's a reality, has been a reality for a few years. And like every new big online phenomenon, it has good consequences and bad consequences. One interesting consequence is that you have works like La Casa de Papel, for example, which are local and locally produced, and which become huge mainstream productions that are distributed throughout the world and are watched by people throughout the globe. Now, with this huge internationalization, which is vector number 2, you have to understand this happens in a scenario where you really have an underdeveloped network of international agreements for royalties distribution. And please look at this I know someone is going to tell me, well, but that's not true for music, you know, especially like if you look at Europe, for example, and if you look to all of the reciprocity agreements that there are between local CMOs, and I know that, but please understand that the buyout phenomenon does not relate exclusively to music. It relates to all of the artistic contributions that go into an audiovisual work. So for the other contents, there is an extremely underdeveloped network of international agreements for rights distribution. So that's important because you have an economic reality of huge international distribution that needs to stand on a totally underdeveloped basis of international distribution for royalties. So that's important. And number 4 is in the audiovisual business, one of the holy grails, legally speaking, for having a successful business is concentrating the rights in the audiovisual production or in the audiovisual producer, because that gives him liberty to explore that production without many legal burdens in as many territory as he. So these 4 vectors mean you have a huge incentive for buyouts to happen. So you cannot ignore this economic reality that underlies the existence of buyout and look at the legal problem as something that stands on its own legs. It doesn't. It has economic foundations. Now, moving to the legal matters in Brazil specifically, this could be said. Much of what I'm going to say is true in many countries in Latin America, especially, for example, if you think about Mexico or if you think about Uruguay, for example, or if you think about Chile. Some countries are special, have very strong remuneration rights, like Argentina, for example. But what I'm going to say about Brazil is generally true for jurisdictions in Latin America. So first, you have a very clear right of assignment of copyrights in Brazil. So there are no limits for that, especially in the music side. Okay, so yes, there is, for example, there is a deadline for exclusive agreements of 10 years, for example. But other than that, you have absolute contractual freedom for rights assignments. Okay, so the buyout is not illegal in Brazil. Buyout is legally viable, and there is no legal problems in making entire assignments. Number 2, and I think this is an important point to bear in mind, you have in Brazil a jurisdiction where collective management is not mandatory. Okay, so when you put these 2 things together, and obviously they relate, because if you had mandatory collective management of rights in Brazil for anything, then it would be hard to have a discussion about whether there's an assignment or not, because whatever you assign, if a work is performed in Brazil, then if it must be paid through collective management, then this makes it a pointless discussion. But these 2 things exist in Brazil, and they make it possible for buyouts to happen. And again, this is not a music, exclusively a music matter. It is very much true also, for example, for other rights, like if you think about artists and actors, for example, there's a big legal discussion in Brazil about whether this 1978 law that forbade integral assignments of copyrights to audiovisual producers is still valid or not valid. So just so you know that this is very much present in the audiovisual business for other fronts as well. And then, as Marisa was mentioning, Brazil is very peculiar in which, this speaks to my economic foundations of this legal reality. Brazil is very special in which the presence of this huge player in Brazil, Global, And the fact that at least in my opinion, the outcome of the presence of this player and of the many negotiations that we have about rights in Brazil, and the strength of ECADE, and this produced a system where there is interesting compensation, even in the presence of eventual buyouts. So that's, Brazil is very particular in many things. This is one of them. But these two, if you need to take anything from my legal part of the speech, is buyouts stand on a right of assignment and a non-mandatory collective management system present in Brazil.
Thank you, Igor. That's very interesting and insightful. And I would argue. Please do.
That we talked about, the two of us, I and Igor, is that really this structure of streaming platforms, audiovisual, is new. We are all learning, and it creates really a complete different world of consumption and the use of music. And so what I understand that Igor is saying, because I always think much more in the economic side than the legal as well, and I put them together because the question of my life is, in the end, who gets what, you know? I think that this is the point, the who gets what of this moment of the digital asks for some conversation that we don't know how to, you know, have this conversation. I mean, authors should go together, and we have the experience that we know for sure that authors went to the European Union, and they made possible to change the article of the new 17, 18 of the new directive. And this is a real success case, was the authors.
It's probably, Maria, a question of balancing things out too, right? Because when we're talking about these economic forces, we're talking about huge economic forces where composers are probably the weak part, which needs the protection.
It's this that Cristina is always saying, that the lobby leverage of composers in front of those big structures. No, it's really something, is an issue. And also the will of the other parts to come into a dialogue and to understand this environment, you know, that is not to repeat the same thing that we always had. Okay, we open our minds and say, okay, we have to change some things. But I think sincerely that composers are not supposed to pay this bill alone. This is my point in the economics. And this is the difficult point. It's the goodwill of the economic power to discuss this and not to have a plan that maybe in the future we use only artificial intelligence. You know, we have the libraries, we put everything together, they do the soundtracks, and it's done, you know.
No humans involved. Wow. I want to let Joe, did you want to?
I'm sorry. Once again, I interrupted. There was a really wonderful, and there are many wonderful points in the Q&A here. Unfortunately, I can't read some of them, but there was one where it said at the bottom of the Q&A here, it said, I understand streaming royalties are very low because there are no advertisers, but even then, if streaming companies do not disclose their numbers, viewers, etc., how can you know the royalties you are entitled to? The royalties you are entitled to according to the show's success, which is a great question. There are many parts to this, but just to hit the main points, we are in a new world. We know that there are literally hundreds of millions, if not billions, of streams of performances now globally through streaming services. And just to be honest, these things have moved so quickly. Everyone is rushing to catch up. I can go back 25 years, which is a very I'm dating myself, but also a similar but completely dissimilar situation. But I think it points to some of the ways we can move forward. When broadcast television and syndicated windows of that broadcast television in the US syndicated throughout the world, those were, I can just tell you personally, when I had a network show, it was very clear that I was receiving value for what I was creating. However, in the cable universe, which was just up and coming, the dollars that I received up front, I was looking at this and it's just, I don't know how I'm ever going to make a living. What was interesting is over time, those dollars went up and up and up as the revenue went up for cable because, and again, Christina, maybe you can help me out, but it's certainly in the US, the PRO dollars come from total revenue from the company, subscription fees, they come from advertising, basically it's all revenue pumped into the same pool. So what's interesting is a lot of these services that did not provide any data are now starting to provide data, which is, they realize that in this ecosystem, there is value on both sides. So I don't want to say, that these are all evil empires. I think they're trying to figure out as quickly as we can. Somebody had mentioned that there are a lot of challenges on their part in terms of clearance across the world. So it is going to be a slow process. We'd like it to be a lot quicker, but we know that the dollars from the PROs will go up and up and up unless people take buyouts. When you take a buyout, the money is taken out of the system forever. We're all going to have to be a little patient to allow the dollars to flow through these streaming services. It's going to take a few years. I've been there. It's painful in the short term, but it's really, again, the distinction between getting a career, having a career and getting the gig. So just to say, this is not the first time this has ever happened. It's just happening much, much quicker on a much, much larger scale. So I don't know, Christina, if you wanted to, here I am, I'm turning into Peter. I'm sorry, Peter, but I just want to make sure I'm not misstating the situation globally in terms of flow of dollars.
No. I mean, I think it's clear from Marisa and Igor's explanations that this is a very complex issue, that it's a very global issue, but it has very, very complex issues regarding each different type of jurisdiction. So I think one of the things which I would recommend here is to try to see some initiatives which are taking place in other jurisdictions, because that we can use that as a guide to try to, first, I'm just referring to lobbying some countries to see what are best practices which are taking place in other countries. So, for example, I mean, I say Igor mentioned, that the holy grail is to concentrate all the rights in the producer. Well, that's something which is not new. I mean, audiovisual producers have had to license their production and get into the market with their film or with their TV series. They've had to do this for forever. That's not something new. I think what's new is that instead of just, I need the rights to broadcast this or to put this in my, for theater exhibition, I'm asking for absolutely all the rights forever, even if it's completely unrelated to my audiovisual production. So I think that's where we need to see, why does a producer need to ask for all the rights for eternity? I mean, that's something which I just think that's something which is being offered or included in the contract, but that's why we need to go back to what Joel mentioned in the beginning. You need to, I mean, we're not talking about composers or directors or screenwriters, which have, massive law firms supporting this. We're talking about young, vulnerable creators, and to know that there's other options, that they don't need to just sign whatever the platform or the broadcaster or whatever put in front of them, that they need to understand that there's options here. So, and just to go back again to another thing which Igor said, I know we're talking about Your Music, Your Future, because that's the US campaign which Joel started. and which CSAC used, because why are we going to reinvent the wheel? We used this enormous campaign from Joel, which had been very successful to get the attention and to give help to composers individually. So that's what we used in other parts of the world to do this Your Music, Your Future International as an educational tool, let's say. It was, the intention of CSAC was to try to make sure that we could use the benefits of Your Music, Your Future US and to change this into an international campaign. So now Your Music, Your Future, we have the Spanish site, the Portuguese site, the Finnish site, the French site, and we're including not just, of course, not legal detailed advice, but just general understanding of the different situations around the world, but with very clear testimonies of composers from very different parts of the world, which have faced buyouts. So, for example, I think one of the most successful TV series in Netflix, which is mentioned before, which is La Casa de Papel, no, the money heist. So we have some testimonies from Manel Santisteban, which is one of the composers of the money heist. So, of course, in the case, for example, of the money heist, if you refer to how that specific TV series has been exploited in Netflix in Spain, well, there you have a remuneration right, which protects composers and directors and screenwriters. That's a solution which has been used in some countries, but it's not typical in many countries. Some other countries just where CSAC does a lot of lobbying also for directors and screenwriters, because for them, I think buyouts is just what's always been the case. They've never had anything, even because the law has a presumption that directors and screenwriters' rights have to be automatically assigned to the producer. I mean, that's something which is very typical in many countries in the world. So there's mechanisms to try to fight that, which is, for example, remuneration rights, which is a big CSAC lobbying campaign. But I think that also in the case of music, because I think that's where there's been this change, because usually this has always gone through author societies, through collective management organizations. A platform, a broadcaster didn't need a buyout. They just had a license from the CMO. So to see these changes, I think, what's very helpful is to see what's going on in some parts of the world where this is a big issue right now and it's being challenged, or we're looking for legal solutions for this through lobbying. One example is the European Union with the copyright directive, with a specific provision supporting proportional remuneration and saying that flat lump sums has to be an exception. It cannot be the general rule. I think that's one clear, very clear legal solution for this. But then we have to support this educational campaign, which we're doing based on Joel's Your Music, Your Future in the US, because we have to try to educate creators so that they understand that there are other options. And of course, if they do decide, because it could be an option. I mean, many creators can think, well, look, I just prefer to get a big sum in the beginning and forget about this. I don't have to chase the producer. I don't care how much, I just want to get a big amount of money. I mean, that's also a free option, which a composer can prefer. But the important thing here is that they understand that if they do that, it's because they have received all the information. They know that there could have been another option, but they've decided to accept a buyout of their work. We don't have to just say that's absolutely inadmissible. It's just that they have to be informed and to know that that may not be the best option. And of course, if they do decide that, they know that another option would be, to follow the success of your work and see what that takes, where that leads you to.
Thank you, Cristina. I think this point it really sums it up. I'm so sorry that we are already reaching our end mark here. Of course, we always knew that 1 hour wouldn't be nearly enough to cover this subject. We know that. We apologize. There have been many questions. Please note that this was being recorded and will be available again in our YouTube site. So, you know, if you catch just half of it or want to review it, we will also take a look at all the questions, because I think it helps us to build events like this for the future. It is, as I said at the beginning, is the first time we have done something like that internationally, but definitely we don't want it to be the last time. We want to do this more and more. And I have to thank...
How can we answer those direct questions? Igor answered one, but there is another one from Virginia.
Yeah. Well, I don't think we will have time to do it live now, Marisa, but we could maybe collect the questions that we think are important, and I can circulate them to you in a way that we can maybe publish them like as an article or something on our site, that we can have a follow-up to that, so we don't lose those questions, because I think that would be very important. And I want to thank you so much, Marisa, Joe, Christina, Igor. Your insights are extremely valuable. Your knowledge and everything you brought to the table today has been excellent. I think the main message we wanted to give out today was very well presented by Christina. Now it is about knowledge. It is about knowing what's in front of you, the options that you have, what the market is doing, and how knowing your options. That is very important. UBC has made it a point to have as much educational panels like this, and if this one I think was a success, so hopefully we will do many others with CISAC, with Your Future, Your Music. It has been a great pleasure for me, so I want to thank you all. Thank you everyone who participated, the UBC communications team, Vanessa, who's always on my side here helping with everything, and I hope to see you all soon. And yeah, that's it. Thank you all.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care.
Bye, Joe. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Peter. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Kisses.